The first transmission came through the Deep Space Monitoring Station on Europa at 0347 hours, Galactic Standard Time. Dr. Sarah Chen was alone in the observation deck when the alien signals pierced through the cosmic background radiation like a scream in the void. The patterns were unlike anything humanity had encountered in their 2 centuries of interstellar exploration. Where previous alien communications had been mathematical, logical, or artistic, these signals carried something else entirely. Pain. Desperation. And, underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to echo across the light years. Sarah's hands trembled as she ran the initial analysis. The signals were coming from the Kepler 442 system, a region that had been marked as a dead zone for the past 50 years. No ships returned from that sector. No probes sent back data. It was as if space itself had swallowed everything that ventured too close. But, now something was calling out from that darkness. "Control, this is Observation Station 7, Sarah spoke into her communicator, her voice barely steady. "We have an unscheduled transmission from Sector 7 Alpha. Request immediate analysis team deployment." The response came back within minutes. "Negative, Station 7. Sector 7 Alpha remains under quarantine directive. Log the transmission and maintain observation protocols only." Sarah stared at the readout, watching the alien signals pulse with their strange rhythm. She had dedicated her life to xenolinguistics, to understanding the voices of other species among the stars. This signal was different from anything in the databases. It wasn't trying to establish mathematical constants or share star charts. It was pleading. 3 days passed before the next transmission arrived, this time stronger and more focused. Sarah had spent those days poring over the data, building translation matrices and pattern recognition algorithms. When the new signals came through, she was ready. The first word she managed to decode made her blood run cold. Help. Not in English, not in any human language, but the concept was unmistakable once she applied xenolinguistic principles. The alien intelligence was asking for help. From the dead zone where ships vanished and space seemed to hunger for anything that entered its domain. Sarah made a decision that would change the course of human history. She sent a reply. Using the same frequency and signal pattern, she transmitted a simple response. Mathematical proof of intelligence, followed by a basic conceptual package. Safety. Peace. Understanding. The universal concepts that xenolinguists used for first contact protocols. The response came back within hours, and it nearly overwhelmed the station's receivers with its intensity. The alien intelligence had been trying to communicate for decades. It had been sending signals into the void, hoping someone, anyone, would answer. And, when Sarah's transmission reached it, the flood of communication that followed painted a picture of horror that shook her to her core. The being called itself something that roughly translated to HFY, though Sarah sensed the name carried deeper meaning about duty and sacrifice. HFY was not alone in the Kepler 442 system. She was trapped there with the remains of what had once been a mighty fleet, now reduced to a handful of dying ships and desperate survivors. They were refugees. War refugees fleeing something so terrible that HFY's species had abandoned their homeworld and scattered across the galaxy. But the war had followed them. The hunters had tracked them to Kepler 442 and laid siege to their final sanctuary. HFY was their queen, their protector, their last hope. And she was failing. The more Sarah learned, the more horrified she became. HFY's people were dying not just from the siege, but from something worse. Despair. They had lost faith in their queen's ability to save them. Some had already chosen to end their lives rather than face capture by their hunters. The weight of responsibility was crushing HFY. She sent streams of data to Sarah, desperate communications that painted a picture of a being barely holding together under impossible pressure. She was making decisions that sent her people to their deaths. She was watching her civilization crumble while she remained helpless to stop it. And then, Sarah learned the most terrible truth of all. The quarantine around Sector 7 Alpha hadn't been imposed to keep humanity safe from whatever lurked in that region. It had been imposed to keep humanity from helping. Because HFY's people were the Vorthake, and humanity knew that name well. 50 years ago, the Vorthak had been the terror of the galaxy. Their fleets had swept through dozens of star systems, conquering and subjugating every species they encountered. They were unstoppable warriors with technology that made human weapons look like primitive clubs. The Vorthak Empire had been expanding toward human space when something had stopped them cold. Something had turned the hunters into the hunted. Now their mighty queen was trapped in a dead system, watching her people die one by one, sending desperate signals into space and receiving only silence in return. Because the galaxy remembered what the Vorthak had done, and no one wanted to help. No one except a lone xenolinguist on a monitoring station who heard the pain in an alien voice and decided that suffering deserved compassion, regardless of past sins. Sarah spent the next week in constant communication with HFY. The alien queen's desperation was palpable in every transmission. She spoke of watching her children starve, of making impossible choices about who would receive the last supplies, of seeing proud warriors reduced to hollow-eyed shells who jumped at shadows. The hunters had not attacked in months. They didn't need to. Time was their weapon, and it was working perfectly. HFY told Sarah about the dreams that haunted what little sleep she managed to get. Dreams where she was a child again, learning the songs of her people. Dreams where she danced at her coronation while her subjects cheered. Dreams where she made her first command decisions with confidence and pride. Then, she would wake to the reality of her dying fleet and the weight of knowing that she was the last queen the Vorthak would ever have. Sarah found herself staying awake for days at a time, coordinating communication windows and poring over every detail HFY shared. She learned about Vorthak culture, their complex social hierarchies, their art and poetry and music. She discovered that beneath the fearsome reputation lay a people not so different from humanity in their fundamental desires for safety, belonging, and purpose. Most importantly, she learned that HFY had been a child when the worst of the Vorthak conquests occurred. The current queen had inherited an empire built on the violence of previous generations, and she had been trying to reform it when the hunters arrived. The hunters who had once been Vorthak slaves. It was a cycle of violence that stretched back generations, and now it was reaching its inevitable conclusion in the cold depths of space around a dead star. The last Vorthak queen was preparing to die with her people, and the galaxy would celebrate the extinction of a species because it would mean the end of an ancient threat. But Sarah Chen was human, and humans had a peculiar talent for refusing to accept the inevitable. She began making plans. The first step was gathering intelligence. Sarah used her position at the monitoring station to access deep archives about the Vorthak. What she found painted a complex picture that went far beyond the simple narrative of evil conquerors that had shaped galactic policy. The Vorthak had indeed been aggressive expansionists, but their empire had also brought stability to chaotic regions of space. They had eliminated piracy, standardized trade routes, and created unprecedented levels of economic prosperity. Their military might have been feared, but their administrative efficiency had been quietly admired. More importantly, Sarah found records that most of the galaxy preferred to ignore. Records of Vorthak leaders who had tried to negotiate peaceful solutions. Records of reform movements within the empire. Records of HFY herself, who had been advocating for a transition to a more peaceful confederation when the Hunter Rebellion began. The Hunters had been slaves, yes. But they had become something far worse than their former masters. Sarah's second step was more dangerous. She began reaching out to contacts within the human scientific community. Carefully, quietly, she shared selected portions of her communications with HFY. She focused on the xenolinguistic aspects, the unprecedented opportunity to study a dying alien language and culture. Most of her colleagues dismissed her work. Some reported her to authorities for violating quarantine protocols. But a few listened. Dr. Marcus Webb, a xenobiologist who had spent his career studying alien evolutionary patterns, became fascinated by Sarah's descriptions of Vorthak's social structure. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a specialist in interspecies psychology, was intrigued by the emotional complexity Sarah had documented in HFY's communications. And Captain James Rodriguez, a freight hauler who had lost friends to Vorthak raids decades ago, surprised everyone by being the first to volunteer for what Sarah was beginning to plan. I've been carrying hate for 50 years, Rodriguez told Sarah during their encrypted conversation. Maybe it's time to try carrying something else. The third step was the most difficult. Sarah had to convince HFY to trust her. The alien queen had good reason to be suspicious. Decades of isolation had taught her that the galaxy wanted her people dead. When Sarah first suggested that humans might be willing to help, HFY's response was a mixture of hope and terror that nearly broke Sarah's heart. Your species fears us, HFY transmitted. We have given you reason to fear us. Why would you risk yourselves for creatures who once planned your conquest? Sarah's response took her 3 hours to compose. She wanted to get it right. Because you're dying, she finally sent back. Because you're in pain. Because you were a child when those conquests happened, and children shouldn't be held responsible for the sins of their parents. Because someone needs to break this cycle of violence before it consumes everyone. And because that's what humans do. We help people who need help, even when it's dangerous. Even when it doesn't make sense. Even when the people we're helping used to be our enemies. HFY's silence stretched for almost a full day. When she finally responded, her transmission was different. Smaller somehow. More vulnerable. I am afraid, she admitted. I am afraid of dying. I am afraid of failing my people. I am afraid of what will happen to the galaxy if the hunters learn to work together after we are gone. But, most of all, I am afraid of hoping. Hope has become a poison to my kind. Every time we believe rescue might come, the disappointment cuts deeper. Then, don't hope for rescue, Sarah replied. Hope for something smaller. Hope that someone, somewhere, gives enough of a damn about suffering to at least try. Hope that you're not alone. Hope that when your people sing the last songs of the Vorthake, someone will hear them and remember that you were more than just the monsters others made you into. That transmission marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. HFY began sharing more personal details about her situation. She told Sarah about the advisors who had stopped coming to strategy meetings because they knew there were no strategies left to try. She described the ritual chambers where her people performed their death songs, preparing for the end with a dignity that broke her heart. She talked about the children. There were still children among the Vorthake survivors. Not many, but enough to remind everyone what they were fighting to preserve. These young ones had never seen their homeworld. They had been born in space, raised on stories of a glorious past they would never experience and a future that grew dimmer every day. HFY had taken personal responsibility for these children. She made sure they received the best food available. She told them stories. She taught them the old songs and dances. And, every day, she wrestled with the knowledge that she was raising them just to watch them die. The children ask me when we will go home, HFY transmitted one day. I do not know how to tell them that home no longer exists. That home is wherever we are, and we are dying. Sarah found herself crying at her workstation. She had studied dozens of alien species, but she had never encountered anything as heartbreaking as this proud queen desperately trying to maintain hope for children who trusted her completely. That night, Sarah made her final decision. She was going to save them. All of them. She didn't know how, and she didn't know if it was even possible. But she was going to try, because someone had to try. Because the alternative was watching an entire species die while the galaxy celebrated. Because someone had to show HFY that hope wasn't poison after all. The next morning, Sarah sent a transmission that would either save the last of the Vorthake or get her court-martialed for treason. I'm coming to get you, she told HFY. I don't know how yet, but I'm coming. You're not going to die alone in that system. Your children are not going to die without seeing what the galaxy has to offer. And your people are going to get a chance to be something better than what they were. HFY's response came back within minutes, and, for the first time since they had begun communicating, Sarah could hear something other than despair in the alien queen's voice. You would risk everything for us? Your career, your safety, your life? Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. Because that's what friends do. And, you are my friend, HFY. The first Vorthake friend humanity has ever had. The silence that followed lasted for hours. When HFY finally responded, her transmission carried a new quality that Sarah had never heard before. It was small and fragile and precious. It was hope. Sarah Chen had never considered herself a rebel. She was a scientist, a scholar who preferred the quiet sanctuary of research stations to the chaos of political intrigue. But, as she sat in the cramped quarters of the freight ship Defiant Hope, watching Captain Rodriguez finalize their approach to the Kepler 442 system, she realized that rebellion had chosen her rather than the other way around. 3 weeks had passed since she made her promise to HFY. 3 weeks of careful planning, quiet recruitment, and the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that made Sarah's head spin. Dr. Webb had used his connections at the Xenobiological Research Institute to secure emergency research funding. Dr. Tanaka had convinced the Interspecies Psychology Council that studying a dying alien culture was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And Rodriguez had somehow managed to requisition a modified freight hauler equipped with medical facilities, translation equipment, and enough supplies to sustain a small refugee population. None of them had mentioned their true intentions to their respective organizations. As far as the official record showed, they were conducting an authorized research mission to study linguistic patterns in deep space transmissions. The reality was far more dangerous. "Sensor contact," announced Lieutenant Eva Santos from the navigation station. Santos had been Rodriguez's second-in-command for 15 years, and she had volunteered for the mission despite knowing exactly what they were risking. Multiple ships, bearing 27 Mark IV. Configuration matches Vorthe K fleet patterns from the archives. Sarah leaned forward in her observer's seat, watching the tactical display resolve into discrete contacts. 12 ships, ranging from massive capital vessels to small escort craft. But the readings told a story of desperation rather than strength. Power signatures were low, hull integrity showed extensive damage, and several of the ships were broadcasting distress signals on multiple frequencies. "They're dying," Dr. Webb observed quietly. The xenobiologist was studying the biological readings from the Vorthe K ships, his expression grim. "Life support is failing on at least 4 vessels. Atmospheric composition is degrading across the fleet." "How long?" Rodriguez asked. "Days, maybe weeks for the larger ships. The escorts won't last the night." Sarah opened a communication channel on the frequency she had been using to talk with HFY. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen aboard the human vessel Defiant Hope. We have arrived as promised. Please respond, HFY." The response came back immediately, but it wasn't the voice Sarah had come to know. This transmission was weaker, distorted by static and interference. When HFY spoke, she sounded exhausted beyond measure. "Sarah Chen. You came." There was wonder in the alien queen's voice, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. We did not think, the children will be so grateful." "Where do you need us?" Sarah asked. "Flagship Dominion's End, coordinates following." "But, Sarah Chen, you must know. The hunters have returned. They detected your approach. They come for us now, and they will not distinguish between Vorthe K and human. You have walked into a trap that was set for us." Rodriguez was already checking his instruments. Long-range sensors confirm multiple contacts approaching from the outer system. 23 ships, moving in standard hunter pack formation. They'll reach us in 6 hours. Dr. Tanaka looked up from her psychological assessment protocols. 6 hours to evacuate how many survivors? Nearly 800 across all ships, HFY transmitted. But many are too weak to be moved. Many have chosen to remain with their vessels for the final battle. I cannot ask my people to abandon their posts for the sake of survival when survival may not be possible. Sarah felt her heart sink. The Defiant Hope could carry perhaps 200 people in emergency conditions. Even if they stripped out all non-essential equipment, they couldn't save everyone. But they could try to save some. "Send us docking coordinates for your most vulnerable ships first," Sarah transmitted. "We'll take on as many as we can. Children and civilians get priority." "And then, what?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "We can't outrun hunter packs in a freight hauler. Those ships were built for pursuit and destruction. Sarah had been thinking about this problem for weeks. The answer was both simple and terrifying. Then, we don't run, she said. We talk. The first group of evacuees came aboard 40 minutes later, and Sarah got her first look at the people she had been trying to save. The Vorthake were tall, elegant beings with elongated limbs and faces that seemed to shift between humanoid and something altogether more alien depending on the angle and lighting. Their skin held an opalescent quality that reminded Sarah of deep ocean creatures, and their large eyes seemed to hold depths of intelligence that made her catch her breath. But it was the children that broke her heart. They were so small, so fragile, clinging to adult caretakers with an obvious trust that their elders would keep them safe. Their eyes were wide with curiosity and fear as they were led through the unfamiliar corridors of the human ship. One little one, barely reaching Sarah's waist, looked up at her with an expression of such hopeful wonder that Sarah had to turn away to hide her tears. Dr. Chen? The voice belonged to one of the adult Vorthake, a being whose bearing suggested significant authority despite obvious exhaustion. I am Thekmar, advisor to Queen HFY. She has spoken of you often. You are the human who offered kindness to enemies. You're not my enemies, Sarah replied. You're people in need of help. Thekmar's expression shifted in a way that Sarah was learning to recognize as surprise. You would say this even knowing our history? Even knowing the pain my species has caused yours? Your species, yes. But not you personally. Not these children. The people who hurt us are mostly dead now. The people in front of me are just trying to survive. Queen HFY said you would speak this way. She said humans possess a strange wisdom about forgiveness that our people have never understood. Sarah watched as Dr. Tanaka helped an elderly Vorthake to a medical station. The alien moved with obvious pain, but there was dignity in every gesture. Pride that hadn't been broken even by decades of exile and suffering. Where is HFY? Sarah asked. She remains aboard the flagship, coordinating the defense. She will not abandon her post while her people are in danger. Then, I need to talk to her. Face to face. Thekmar's reaction was immediate and alarmed. Dr. Chen, the flagship is the hunter's primary target. To go there now would be suicide. Maybe. But, I've come this far. I'm not leaving without meeting her properly. The docking tube connecting the Defiant Hope to the Vorthake flagship Dominion's End felt like a bridge between two different worlds. The human ship was cramped but functional, built for efficiency and practicality. The Vorthake vessel was something else entirely. Even damaged and failing, the Dominion's End maintained an aesthetic that spoke of a culture that valued beauty as much as function. The corridors were tall and gracefully curved, decorated with flowing patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the artificial lighting. Emergency illumination cast everything in a pale blue glow that made the ship feel like an underwater palace. But the beauty couldn't hide the signs of desperation. The air recycling systems wheezed and struggled. Blast damage scarred the walls where internal explosions had torn through protective systems. And everywhere, Sarah could see the Vorthake crew moving with the slow precision of people who had been pushed beyond their limits for too long. They led her to the command center through corridors lined with tapestries that told the story of the Vorthake people. Sarah couldn't read the alien symbols, but the images were clear enough. Great ships exploring the void between stars. Cities that stretched toward alien skies. Families and children and celebrations that spoke of a culture rich with life and joy. And then, near the end, darker images. War. Destruction. The scattering of a people across the cold emptiness of space. The command center doors opened onto a space that took Sarah's breath away. The chamber was vast, dominated by a raised platform where a single figure stood surrounded by holographic displays showing the tactical situation. The walls curved upward to form a dome decorated with what looked like a map of the galaxy, with thousands of tiny lights marking stars and nebulae and the paths between them. But it was the figure at the center of it all that captured Sarah's attention. Queen HFY was magnificent. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her opalescent skin shimmering with patterns of light that seemed to reflect her emotional state. Her face was alien but undeniably regal, with high cheekbones and large eyes that held depths of intelligence and pain that made Sarah's chest tighten. She wore robes that seemed to be made of starlight itself, flowing and shifting with every movement. But it was the weight of responsibility in her bearing that struck Sarah most deeply. This was a being who carried the survival of her entire species on her shoulders, and the burden was visible in every line of her posture. HFY turned as Sarah approached, and their eyes met for the first time. "Sarah Chen," the queen said, and her voice carried harmonics that made Sarah's name sound like music. "You are smaller than I expected." Sarah found herself laughing despite the gravity of the situation. "You're taller than I expected. And yet you came. Despite the danger, despite the obstacles, despite having every reason to let us die in this forgotten place. Why?" Sarah looked around the command center, taking in the dedication of the crew members who continued working even as their ship slowly died around them. She thought of the children she had just helped evacuate, their eyes full of trust and hope. She thought of Thekmar's surprise that anyone would offer kindness to former enemies. "Because someone had to," she said finally. "Because suffering is suffering, regardless of who's experiencing it. Because children are children, whether they're human or Vorthak. And because you asked for help, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to answer." HFY studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, the alien queen stepped down from her platform and approached Sarah directly. "You speak of children," HFY said. "Do you have offspring of your own?" "No," Sarah admitted. "But I was a child once. I remember what it felt like to be small and scared and dependent on adults to keep me safe. Every child deserves to feel that safety, regardless of what species they belong to." "Even Vorthak children? Even the offspring of the people who once planned to conquer your worlds?" "Especially them," Sarah said firmly. "Because they're the ones who can choose to be better than their ancestors. They're the ones who can break the cycle." HFY was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than Sarah had ever heard it. "I have failed them," the queen said. "I have failed all of my people. I became queen at a time when my species needed transformation, and instead I have presided over their extinction. The children you speak of will die here, in this cold place, because I could not find a way to save them." "No," Sarah said firmly. "They're going to live. Some of them, at least. We're taking them with us." "To where?" "The galaxy has no place for the Vorthak. We are too feared, too hated. There is nowhere we can go where the hunters will not eventually find us." "Then, we make a place," Sarah said. "Humans are good at that. We find empty worlds, or dangerous worlds, or worlds that nobody else wants, and we make them home. We've been doing it for centuries." HFY's expression shifted, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something that might have been hope. "You would do this? Your people would accept Vorthak refugees?" "Some of them will," Sarah said honestly. "Others won't. But the ones who matter will understand that this is the right thing to do. And once the children grow up among us, once they become part of human communities, it won't matter what their parents used to be. They'll just be people." An alarm began sounding throughout the command center, and one of the crew members called out a report in the Vorthak language. "The hunters have arrived," HFY translated. "They are demanding our surrender. They offer to make our death swift if we do not resist." Sarah looked at the tactical display, watching the hunter ships take positions around the dying Vorthak fleet. 23 vessels against 12, and most of the Vorthak ships were barely functional. "What are you going to tell them?" she asked. HFY straightened, and for a moment Sarah saw the queen she must have been in better times. Proud, confident, unbroken. "I am going to tell them that Queen HFY does not surrender. That the Vorthak will die as they lived, with honor and dignity. And that their sacrifice will be remembered by those who understand the value of courage in the face of hopelessness." "What if there was another option?" Sarah asked. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath. What she was about to suggest was either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. "What if we talked to them? What if we tried to convince them to let us take the non-combatants? The children and civilians who had nothing to do with the old empire? HFY stared at her. The hunters do not negotiate, Sarah Chen. They are driven by hatred that has burned for generations. They will not show mercy to any who carry Vorthake blood. Maybe not, Sarah admitted. But maybe they'll listen to someone who isn't Vorthake. Maybe they'll listen to a human who's asking them to choose mercy over revenge. And if they refuse? Then, at least we tried. At least we gave peace a chance before we gave in to violence. HFY was quiet for a long moment, her large eyes studying Sarah's face. When she finally spoke, there was something new in her voice. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. You truly believe this could work? I believe it's worth trying, Sarah said. I believe that most people, when given the choice between cruelty and kindness, will choose kindness if they think they can do so without appearing weak. The hunters do not see kindness as strength. Then, maybe it's time someone taught them differently. HFY moved to her command platform and began inputting commands. Very well, Dr. Sarah Chen. I place the fate of my people in your hands. May your strange human wisdom prove stronger than generations of hatred. As the communication channel opened and Sarah prepared to speak with beings who had every reason to want her dead simply for standing with their enemies, she found herself thinking about the children in the Defiant Hope's cargo bays. Young ones who deserved a chance to grow up and choose their own paths. She was about to find out if the galaxy still had room for mercy. The hunter fleet formed a perfect attack formation around the dying Vorthake ships, their vessels sleek and predatory against the backdrop of distant stars. Sarah stood beside Queen HFY on the bridge of the Dominion's end, watching the tactical display with a mixture of fear and determination that made her hands shake. They are responding to our communication request, reported one of HFY's officers. The hunter pack leader agrees to speak with the human who dares stand with the remnants of the Empire. Sarah nodded, wiping her palms on her uniform. Everything she had worked for, everything she believed about the power of compassion and understanding, was about to be tested against centuries of hatred and revenge. The main display shimmered and resolved into the image of a being that made Sarah's breath catch. The hunter pack leader was clearly related to the Vorthake, but generations of genetic modification and surgical enhancement had transformed them into something altogether more frightening. Where HFY was elegant and graceful, this being was angular and sharp, with metallic implants that gleamed along their skull and jaw. Their eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of pain transformed into purpose. I am Warsinger Kethen AK of the Liberation Fleet, the hunter leader said, their voice carrying electronic overtones that made every word sound like a weapon. I speak for all those who suffered under the boot of the Vorthake Empire. You claim to be human, yet you stand with our oppressors. Explain yourself before I decide whether to grant you the mercy of a swift death. Sarah forced herself to stand straight, meeting those burning eyes directly. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, xenolinguist with the Human Scientific Consortium. I'm here because I heard someone calling for help, and I couldn't ignore that call. Help? Kethen AK's laugh was like breaking glass. The Vorthake seek help now? After centuries of giving none? After enslaving my people and countless others across the galaxy? After treating us as property to be bought and sold? The Vorthake who did those things are dead, Sarah replied steadily. These are the survivors. Refugees. Children who were born after the Empire fell. People who had nothing to do with the crimes you're seeking to punish. They carry the blood. Kethen AK snarled. They carry the genetic legacy of monsters. As long as any Vorthake lives, the possibility of a new empire remains. Sarah glanced at HFY, seeing the pain in the Queen's expression as she listened to the hatred in her former subject's voice. This was what guilt looked like, Sarah realized. This was the weight of inheriting the crimes of previous generations. You're wrong, Sarah said, turning back to the screen. People aren't responsible for what their ancestors did. Children aren't born evil because their parents made bad choices. If we punish people for crimes they didn't commit, then we become the monsters. Kethen AK leaned forward, their enhanced features twisting with rage. Monsters? You dare call us monsters? We who spent generations in chains? We who watched our families torn apart to feed Vorthak expansion? We who were experimented on and modified and tortured for the amusement of their nobility? I don't call you monsters, Sarah said quietly. I call you people who have been hurt so badly that you think causing more hurt is the only way to heal. But it isn't. Revenge doesn't heal anything. It just spreads the pain to the next generation. Pretty words from someone who never felt the lash, Kethanak spat. Tell me, human, would you be so quick to forgive if these creatures had enslaved your species? Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about that question seriously. It deserved an honest answer. I don't know, she finally admitted. I've never experienced what you've experienced. I can't imagine what it would feel like to carry that much pain. But I do know that killing children won't bring back the people you lost. And I know that if you destroy every last Vorthak, you'll still carry that hurt inside you. The only way to truly defeat the Empire is to prove you can be better than they were. Kethanak was silent for several seconds, their enhanced eyes studying Sarah with an intensity that made her feel like she was being dissected. When they spoke again, their voice was quieter but no less dangerous. You speak of children. How many children do you think died when Vorthak fleets reduced our worlds to ash? How many younglings were separated from their parents and sold to the highest bidder? How many innocents paid the price for Vorthak ambition? Too many, Sarah said simply. And I'm sorry for that. More sorry than I can express. But those children are gone, and killing more children won't bring them back. All it will do is create more orphans, more pain, more reasons for the next generation to seek revenge. Behind her, she heard HFY move closer. The queen's voice was soft, almost broken. Kethanak, HFY said, and the hunter leader's attention snapped to her with laser focus. Do you remember the gardens of Vorth Prime? The crystal pools where younglings learned to swim? You were barely more than a child yourself when the rebellion began. I remember everything, Kethanak replied, their voice like winter wind. I remember beauty built on the bones of slaves. I remember luxury purchased with suffering. I remember thinking it was normal because I had never seen anything else. Do you remember the promise I made when I became queen? HFY continued. That things would change? That the old ways would die with the old rulers? I remember lies, Kethanak said. I remember pretty speeches while the machinery of oppression continued to grind forward. Change was too slow, too little. By the time you decided to reform the empire, we had already decided to destroy it. HFY bowed her head. You were right to rebel. The empire deserved to fall. I only wish. I wish we could have found a way to change without so much death. Death was inevitable, Kethanak replied. The only question was whose death it would be. Sarah stepped forward again. But it doesn't have to be inevitable now. The empire is gone. The old rulers are dead. The systems of oppression have been destroyed. What's left here are just people trying to survive. What's left here, Kethanak corrected, is the seed of a new empire. As long as any Vorthak live, as long as they remember their glorious past, there is a chance they will try to rebuild what was destroyed. Then, help them build something better instead. The words hung in the silence of space for a long moment. Kethanak stared at Sarah as if she had spoken in an alien language. What did you say? Sarah took a deep breath. This was the crucial moment, the point where everything would either work or fall apart completely. Help them build something better, she repeated. You know better than anyone what was wrong with the old empire. You lived it, suffered under it, fought against it. Who better to guide them away from those mistakes? You're suggesting we join with them? Work with our former oppressors? I'm suggesting you help them become something other than oppressors, Sarah said. The children aboard these ships have never known empire. They've only known exile and suffering and fear. They have no attachment to the old ways because they've never experienced them. They're blank slates, ready to learn whatever you teach them. Kethanak was quiet for a long time, their enhanced features unreadable. When they finally spoke, their voice carried a note of confusion that hadn't been there before. You would have us raise Vorthake children? Teach them our values? Our ways? I would have you help them become people who would never repeat their ancestors' mistakes, Sarah said. People who understand suffering because they've experienced it themselves. People who know the value of freedom because they've lived without it. On the tactical display, Sarah could see the hunter ships holding position but not advancing. The attack that should have come by now was being delayed while their leader wrestled with possibilities they had never considered. And what of her? Kethenake asked, their gaze shifting to Zephi. What of the last queen of the empire that enslaved us? Sarah looked at Zephi, seeing the resignation in the alien queen's posture. Zephi believed she was going to die here, and she had accepted it as the price of her people's survival. But Sarah had other ideas. She makes amends, Sarah said firmly. She spends whatever life she has left helping to heal the damage the empire caused. She uses her knowledge and experience to make sure the mistakes of the past are never repeated. She becomes a teacher instead of a ruler, a guide instead of a conqueror. You ask much of us, Kethenake said slowly. To forgive. To trust. To work with those we have spent lifetimes learning to hate. I ask you to choose healing over revenge, Sarah replied. I ask you to be the change you wanted to see in the galaxy. I ask you to prove that you're better than the people who hurt you. Kethenake was silent again, and Sarah could almost see the internal struggle playing out behind their enhanced features. Generations of pain warred with the possibility of a different kind of future. There would be conditions, the hunter leader said finally. Strict conditions. The Vorthake survivors would be scattered among our settlements, integrated into our communities. They would live as we live, work as we work. There would be no special privileges, no acknowledgement of their former status. Sarah's heart leaped with hope. And the children? Would be raised as our own. Taught our history, our values. They would know what their ancestors did, and they would understand why it was wrong. And Queen Zephi? Kethenake's gaze fixed on the Vorthake queen with an intensity that made the air seem to vibrate. She comes with us. She sees what the empire did to its victims. She learns what her people's glory cost others. And she spends the rest of her days making sure that knowledge is preserved and passed down. Zephi straightened, meeting her former subject's gaze without flinching. I accept these terms. Even knowing that you will spend your remaining years confronting the consequences of your ancestors' actions? Even knowing that you will never again be treated as royalty? I stopped being royalty the day my empire fell, Zephi replied. I have been nothing but a guardian for the innocent ever since. If I can continue to serve that purpose under your guidance, then I will consider my life well spent. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched former enemies take the first tentative steps toward cooperation. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was possible, and sometimes possibility was enough. There is one more condition, Kethenake said, their attention returning to Sarah. You, Dr. Sarah Chen, will come with us as well. You will serve as liaison between our peoples and yours. You will help ensure that this arrangement benefits all parties. Me? Sarah was startled by the request. I'm just a scientist. I don't have any diplomatic training. You have something more valuable than training, Kethenake replied. You have the strange human ability to see people rather than enemies. You hear pain rather than politics. We will need that perspective if this alliance is to survive. Sarah looked around the bridge of the Dominion's end, taking in the faces of the Vorthake crew members who had been listening to the entire conversation. She saw hope there for the first time since she had met them. Not hope for victory or glory, but hope for simple survival and the chance to be better than their past. I'll need to discuss this with my colleagues, Sarah said. But, yes. If you'll have me, I'll help make this work. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the settlement ship New Harmony, watching a group of mixed children play in the ship's central garden. Vorthake and former slave species ran and laughed together, their differences forgotten in the simple joy of being young and safe. Zephi approached from behind, moving with the quiet grace that had become her trademark since giving up her royal status. The former queen now served as a teacher and historian, helping the settlement's children understand the complexities of their shared heritage. The integration proceeds well, HFY observed, watching as a young Vorthak girl helped a hunter child reach fruit growing high on one of the garden trees. Better than I hoped, Sarah admitted. When Kethanak first proposed mixing the populations, I was worried about conflicts. But the children adapt so easily. Children are remarkable that way, HFY agreed. They judge each other by actions rather than ancestry. Perhaps that is why your species values them so highly. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the reports she had sent back to human space over the past months. The early data from the integration experiment was promising enough that several human colonies had expressed interest in hosting Vorthak refugees. The fear and hatred that had defined galactic politics for decades was slowly giving way to curiosity and cautious cooperation. Any regrets? Sarah asked. HFY considered the question seriously before answering. I regret the pain my people caused. I regret the years of war and suffering. I regret that it took so long for us to find this path. She paused, watching the children play. But I do not regret coming here. I do not regret learning what it means to live without the burden of command. And I do not regret the friendship you offered when I had nothing left to give in return. You had plenty to give, Sarah said. You just didn't realize it yet. A communication alert chimed from Sarah's datapad. She glanced at the message and smiled. Good news? HFY asked. The Centauri colony has agreed to accept 50 families. They're particularly interested in Vorthak agricultural techniques. Sarah showed HFY the message. Apparently, the theoretical framework your people developed for terraforming could revolutionize food production on marginal worlds. The Empire's knowledge put to constructive use, HFY mused. There is a certain poetic justice to that. As they watched, Kethanak emerged from the main settlement complex, carrying a data tablet and wearing the expression of someone dealing with complex logistics. The former hunter leader had adapted to their new role as settlement coordinator with surprising effectiveness, though they still struggled with the transition from warrior to administrator. Dr. Chen, Kethanak called out as they approached. We have received a response from the Vegan Trade Alliance regarding the cultural exchange proposal. And they are interested. Cautiously, but interested. They wish to send a delegation to observe our community before committing to any formal agreements. Sarah felt a familiar surge of excitement. Each new contact, each expression of interest, represented another step toward a galaxy where former enemies could work together instead of destroying each other. When do they arrive? 2 weeks. I wanted to give you time to prepare your presentation on human intervention philosophy. My what now? Kethanak's enhanced features shifted into what Sarah had learned to recognize as their version of amusement. The delegation specifically requested information about the human approach to conflict resolution. Apparently, word is spreading about the species that convinced ancient enemies to become allies through nothing more than conversation and compassion. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. It wasn't just me. You and HFY did the hard work. All I did was ask everyone to try something different. Sometimes that is the most difficult thing of all, HFY observed. To try something different when all your instincts tell you to repeat the patterns of the past. As if summoned by their conversation, a group of the settlement's children approached the observation deck. The mix of species represented there would have been unthinkable just a few months ago, but now it seemed perfectly natural. Teacher HFY, one of the young ones, called out, a hunter child whose biological modifications had been carefully reversed through medical intervention. Are you going to tell us about the old songs tonight? If you wish to hear them, HFY replied gently. Though I should warn you, some of the old songs are quite sad. That's okay, another child said, this one a young Vorthak whose opalescent skin shimmered with excitement. Sad songs help us understand why things were wrong before. And they make the happy songs even better. Sarah exchanged glances with Kethanak and HFY, seeing her own amazement reflected in their expressions. These children, born from conflict and raised in cooperation, seemed to understand instinctively what their elders had taken lifetimes to learn. In that case, Zephi said, perhaps we should gather the whole community tonight. It has been too long since we shared the complete history of our peoples, both the darkness and the light. As the children ran off to spread the word about the evening's storytelling session, Sarah found herself thinking about the message she would send to Earth that night. The weekly reports had become a tradition, documenting not just the progress of the integration experiment but the gradual transformation of participants from refugees and warriors into citizens and neighbors. Dr. Chen, Kethanak said quietly, may I ask you something? Of course. That first day, when you spoke to me across the void between our ships, what made you so certain that this could work? Sarah thought about the question for a moment, remembering the fear and hope and desperation that had driven her to risk everything for strangers who had once been labeled as enemies. I wasn't certain at all, she admitted. I was terrified that I was wrong, that I was making everything worse, that I was getting good people killed for nothing. She paused, watching through the observation windows as the settlement's diverse population went about their daily activities. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't try. I was more afraid of living in a galaxy where suffering was ignored because the victims belonged to the wrong species. And now? Zephi asked. Are you still afraid? Sarah smiled, thinking of the children who saw differences as interesting rather than threatening, of former enemies who had become colleagues and friends, of the slow but steady progress toward a galaxy where cooperation might one day be stronger than conflict. Every day, she said. But it's a different kind of fear now. Now I'm afraid of not living up to the example these communities are setting. I'm afraid of failing to preserve what we've all built together. As the day shifted toward evening and the settlement prepared for another night of shared stories and mutual understanding, Sarah made her way to her quarters to compose her weekly report. But, first, she took one more look at the observation deck where she had spent so many hours watching the impossible become routine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that kindness was not weakness and that understanding was not naive idealism. The galaxy was slowly learning what one lonely xenolinguist had known all along. Sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was simply the decision to care about someone else's pain. And sometimes that was enough to change everything.